Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel on essential ecosystems. I'm Geoff Mohan. I'm the environment editor at the Los Angeles Times. I'm going to introduce to you a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel here and read a bit from their books, and then we'll get on with what I hope will be a robust conversation. To my left here is Tim Flannery. He's the author of Here on Earth, A Natural History of the Planet. He's a mammalogist, paleontologist, and a leading voice on climate change. He's the only one on the panel, as far as I can tell, maybe you can correct me, to have a bat species named for him. So if any of you have a bat species name, now's the time to speak up. And he's said to have discovered more animal species than Charles Darwin, who's not here to defend himself. His previous book, The Weather Makers, stands probably to this day as one of the more lucid explanations of man-made climate change and its expected impacts that you'll find on a bookshelf. Here on Earth, in Here on Earth, he tackles the evolution of the macroorganism we know as Earth through the prism of the Gaia theory, which sees Earth, her ecosystems, and inorganic components as intertwined in a self-regulating system. That system is now being skewed by its most destructive habitants, us, leading some to believe that we'll have instead a Median future, one in which we essentially devour our own offspring and our future. He poses and answers the question of whether we're doomed to overconsume and drive ourselves into extinction, or whether some multifaceted co-evolution will help restore the balance. I'm going to allow him to explain his conclusions further on, but I'd like to read a passage from his book. This is from the chapter called Biophilia, which is led by a passage from John 13 in the King James Bible that says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. Since our emergence from Africa 50,000 years ago, the sweep of human history has been a tale of destruction that has crippled one ecosystem after another. So what justifies the view that humans have the capacity for a cooperative, sustainable, Gaian future? Those who killed the last mammoth or the last hobbit had no idea that they were extinguishing a species, much less altering ecosystems, for their worldview extended only as far as their clan boundaries. To concentrate only on the destruction they wrought is a bit like understanding evolution's cruel mechanism without acknowledging its legacy. As a human frontier passed, those people left in its wake found themselves reliant on an impoverished ecosystem from which extinctions and dislocations had removed many resources. It would have been possible for those hunter-gatherers to continue their lethal course, but instead, in most instances, co-evolution slowly drew them into a balance with the new ecosystems they had helped create." To my right here is Brian Fagan. He is by vocation an anthropologist and archaeologist whose focus on prehistory and human relationships to its environment and climate offers insight into the plight of modern Homo sapiens. His more noted popular work, The Great Warming, Climate Change and the Rise and Fall of Great Civilizations, focuses on the warming period of the 12th and 13th century in Europe and its effects on human history. He moves pretty far back in history in his latest work, Cro-Magnon, where he examines these anatomically modern humans and how they adapted and endured while their near neighbors and cohabitants of the same ecosystem, the Neanderthals, passed into extinction. And he offers some interesting theories on how that happened. Brian has shown an uncanny ability to draw from many disciplines and experiences to overcome the limits of the archaeological record, which often is quite spare, and build very imaginative and illuminating verbal dioramas that literally flesh out the bare bones of prehistory. If you haven't read any of his books, you might find them quite different than most books you will read on anthropology or archaeology. In Cro-Magnon, he examines small articles such as collections of bone and ivory flutes and a figurine of lion man to place Cro-Magnons in the context of their beliefs and their relationship with their ecosystems. So let me give you a little bit from that. The Cro-Magnons spent most of their time not hunting but watching for hours, days, even weeks. They lived among a bestiary whose behavior they knew as well as their own. They were familiar with the animal routines of feeding and drinking, birth, courting, and death. Every hunter knew when reindeer were in top condition, the subtle color changes in the fur of Arctic foxes, the sometimes dramatic changes in appearance that accompanied different social behaviors in all manner of beasts. Every Cro-Magnon knew more about animal behavior than most 21st century biologists. They lived so close to their prey that they were part of their quarry's lives. It was this knowledge, based on meticulous observation, that made them successful hunters. I'm going to skip to another passage. People survive because they know their environment intimately, because they depend on others, and also because of the rich ceremonial life and intricate ritual beliefs that link them to the animals they hunt and to the complex forces of the natural world. In that respect, nothing has changed, for one of the most powerful legacies of the Cro-Magnons was their ability to integrate the intangible and material worlds into a single human existence. Last but not least, on my furthest left is Stephen Solomon. He's a journalist and author whose earlier work, Confidence Game, examined the dominant role of central bankers in dictating the parameters of life for humans worldwide. And I did ask him earlier what the relationship would be to a new book on the history of water. And he said, well, they both deal with liquidity. So, we all have to make our connections in this world. He moves in a really, really new direction in the latest work, Water, the Epic Struggle for Wealth, Power, and Civilization. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Awards. And in it, Stephen examines the sweep of history through the prism of water, describing the rise and fall of so-called hydraulic societies that mastered the water ecosystem of their time and their space and rose to the challenges of those water ecosystems. Those societies that were able to take advantage of the opportunities presented by water and to rise to the challenge of its scarcity flourished. Those that did not or neglected their watery ecosystem declined or disappeared. Water is the essential ecosystem that helped determine forms of government, technological progress, and the very survival of civilizations. It's fortunate we're taking a look at this work in Southern California, of course, where water sustains and plagues us, and where our future hangs in the balance of our adaptation to an arid ecosystem. Here's another depressing chapter for you. I always say I'm the environment editor, and people want to walk on the other side of the street because they always expect me to fill them with doom and gloom. But I promise you, there'll be optimism up here. The long sweep of history revealed that long-enduring civilizations were underpinned by effective water control using the technology and organization methods of its time. Whether it was the irrigation canals of ancient Mesopotamia, the Grand Canal of imperial China, the water wheels and steam engine of early industrial Europe, or the giant multi-purpose dams of the 20th century, societies that rose to preeminence responded to the water challenge of their ages by exploiting their water resource potential in ways that invariably were more productive, larger in scale, and unleashed larger usable supplies than their slower adapting rivals. In contrast, unmet water challenges, a failure to maintain waterworks structure, or simply being overtaken by more productive water management elsewhere, was a common factor for many of history's declines and collapses. Likewise, the economic productiveness and political equilibrium of today's advanced societies depends critically upon the robustness, security, and continuous innovative development of an interlinked array of giant dams, electric power plants, aqueducts, reservoirs, pumps, distribution pipes, sanitary sewage systems, wastewater treatment facilities, irrigation canals, drainage systems, and levees, as well as transport waterworks, including port facilities, dredgers, bridges, tunnels, and ocean-spanning shipping fleets. In the unfolding reality of the new millennium, water use and infrastructure are also at the heart of the interlinked challenges of food, energy shortage, and climate change, dictating the fate of human civilization. So, with that foundation, I'd like to ask our authors a few questions. I think I'll start with Tim. We'll put you on the spot first. In your book, you take issue with a fairly common interpretation of evolution. In fact, its most common phrase, survival of the fittest. And you offer that as quite a problematic phrase, and that, in fact, different ways of interpreting that are at the core of us finding a way to get through this potentially very scary future that we're facing. So how do you reconcile the brutal competition that goes on in evolution, nature red in tooth and claw, as the poet said, with your view of this commonwealth of virtue that can be directed and steered by humans? In other words, a more cooperative sense that results.
Sure, yeah. Well, look, Darwin's idea was a really simple one at heart. He basically just observed that in every population there's quite a bit of variability, and that some of those variants are more suited to the conditions they find themselves in than others, and that over the vastness of geological time that was being discovered in Darwin's age, that process had the potential to create all of the biodiversity on Earth, every single species on our planet. And everything about us and all of the things we create are all the products of evolution by natural selection. So our markets, our society and everything else is all the product of evolution by natural selection. And as Ed Wilson said of civilizations, he said, you know, that ants and humans have one thing in common: both can create great civilizations without the use of reason. It just brings home the point that we haven't designed this civilization of ours. It's a product of evolution by natural selection. Everything we see about the world is that way. When Darwin produced that idea, unfortunately, it was the height of the British Imperium. It was a period of great and gross inequality around the world, and a period when people were still able to argue a special case for themselves. And the title of his book, when he produced it, was the subtitle, was something like "And on the Preservation of Favoured Races," is what he said. And of course, if I was going to a bookshop in the 19th century and buying a book and saw that title, I wouldn't be thinking about worms that were just a little bit better at being worms as being the favoured races, right? And people immediately adapted these ideas to their own society. Herbert Spencer was the guy who came up with survival of the fittest as a phrase, and it was immediately taken up by people to justify the unjustifiable, by the ruling class to justify. Over time, it gave rise to a lot of undesirable elements in our society, from National Socialism to eugenics through to neoclassical economics, I'd argue. That had an influence on all of those trends. And that is wrong because what that phrase refers to, if at anything at all, and I don't even think it's right in terms of the world we live in, but the idea that the evolution's mechanism is ruthless, cruel and amoral, that's true. It is. It only has variation and death to work with, so it has to be. But if you're interested in what evolution has produced, in other words, what is the legacy produced by that mechanism, you cannot come away thinking of it as a dog-eat-dog world or a survival of the fittest world. It's created incredible interrelations, and I'll just talk briefly about our own bodies, just as an example. I mean, I've got hundreds of species of fungi and bacteria living on my skin. I do wash, even though I'm an Australian. We do wash. We use soap and all that, you know. But
you use less water, though.
We use less water, exactly. But we've still got hundreds of species living on our skin. I mean, it's been estimated that 10% of all of us by body mass is other species. Right? There's mites that live only at the base of the human eyebrows, others that live only in the eyelashes, and we can't survive without them. Right? We are ecosystems of nearly planetary complexity, involving thousands of species, co-evolved in an interdependency that is astonishing, all result of evolution by natural selection. Even our cells, I mean the little mitochondria that power our cells, they're not us. They began life as free-living bacteria 1 billion years ago that came to live in our cells, and now we cannot exist for a millisecond without them. So that's evolution's legacy, and what's true for me and my body and all of your bodies is true for the planet as a whole. It is a story of intricate interdependencies and interrelationships that produce a productive ecosystem that is far more powerful than any single species could ever achieve. It's like our economic system where the division of labour does the same thing.
Well, I'd like to ask Brian, since we have a kind of future thinker here, you're someone who's intimately acquainted with what went on with human beings in the past. Are there lessons and warnings that we could glean from what happened with the Neanderthals versus what happened with the Cro-Magnons? I was wondering if you could elucidate a bit on how they coexisted in roughly the same time and place, yet one of them survived and one did not, and whether you see any lessons that we ought to be looking at from that.
I love these nice, easy questions.
Oh yeah, I'm here for softballs, totally. So,
Oops, sorry.
that's my softball. The audience is going to be a lot harder on you.
Oh yeah. The relationship between Neanderthals and incoming anatomically modern humans, as we're supposed to call them, is one of the great debates about the human history. And it is a debate that will never be entirely resolved. The consensus seems to be that modern humans, with their full array of cognitive abilities, simply eventually pushed the Neanderthals out and into extinction. We are Homo sapiens. We're the wise people. We're capable of rational and irrational thought. We're capable of planning ahead. We love, we hate, we communicate with great brilliance verbally and non-verbally. We paint on cave walls. We express ourselves. We have profound and intricate spiritual beliefs. The Neanderthals, if they had any of these things, had them on a very limited scale. What they were the final expression of archaic lifeways and archaic human forms that go back a good 1.5 million years, if not more. And they reached the end of the line when confronted with these people. How the extinction happened is a matter of debate. There were those who loved the thought of modern humans beating the Neanderthals to death and eating them. I'm sorry, no one in their sane mind, a modern human, is going to attack a Neanderthal because the Neanderthals were extremely strong.
And not very tasty.
Neanderthals literally hunted big game with spears. Now, if you're going to hunt a big animal like a bison with a spear, you've got to get right up close and personal. You've got to get this close. Why? Because of the range and the penetrating power of your spear. You've literally got to jump onto that bison to kill it. No wonder they had a lot of upper arm injuries. They were like rodeo competitors. Cro-Magnon, smart, lighter, had spear throwers. I could kill the gentleman with the cap over there. I don't really know. Just to give you one example. The other thing they could do is plan a level of cooperation between people who often didn't know each other at a level that Neanderthals never could. The Neanderthals were brilliant observers, which is something I wrote about the Cro-Magnons. And there were very few of them, and very few Cro-Magnons at first. And I suspect it was just a gradual process where the one was superseded by the other. And we will never know the mechanisms exactly as to why. The youngest Neanderthals, 28 to 30,000 years ago, probably in southern Spain. But anyone who says, for example, as one idiot did to me the other day, surely you know the Neanderthals were the ancestors of the Jews. And he was serious. Or anyone on these fanciful things you find on Yahoo, forget it. It's very complicated and very sophisticated.
So we do know that the wiser, more cooperative of the two, the one that had a better connection with complex beliefs is the one that survived.
Yes.
We're just not sure
You,
of the mechanism.
what everyone in this room should do, whether you're interested in archaeology or not, and most people aren't, is to go and see the Herzog movie, which was in your paper a couple of days ago, about the Chauvet Cave. Have you seen it?
No.
No. This is made by a brilliant filmmaker, and it's about the emotional impact of these cave paintings. It is said to be extraordinary, because these people, like Her Majesty the Queen, God bless her, knew everything there was to know about the effects of light and shade and public theatre, or private theatre, and their lives thrived around that relationship.
What was it called? You can say.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
The movie, what was it called?
I don't know the name of it. Consult your Los Angeles Times.
Somebody please
I think it was yesterday.
quickly
or the day
Google
before.
it.
Does anyone know?
Wait, we have a, what?
Cave Forgotten.
Cave of Forgotten Dreams seems to be the
Don't.
preponderance of answers.
Seriously, don't miss it. Apparently it's fabulous. I mean, I got emails from archaeologists raving about it, and some who definitely don't. But it's worth seeing.
Okay, we're going to move on to Stephen. You describe water as the new oil, the commodity of the 21st century that's likely to determine the trajectory of human development and possibly its evolution. Are we doomed to replicate the current state of affairs with oil, in which we have a world of haves and have-nots in constant tension, constant conflict, oftentimes at war, of superpowers bullying those with aquatic disadvantages?
Well, first let me say, one reviewer of the book Water did correct me on that, saying about water being the new oil, is really that oil became temporarily the new water. That water throughout history has been, which was of course my point in my book, and in a sense water is now reasserting in many regards its primacy in its importance. But even in the, and just an interesting side fact, even in the age of the last century, I think there's an estimate that energy use grew about 13 times, multiplied by 13 times. Water grew 9 times. Water use grew 9 times. Population quadrupled. So even in this age of water, and that partly is testimony because water and energy actually are very closely related, and we use a lot of water to produce energy and a lot of energy actually to move water to where we want it to go. The answer to your question, though, the way I've sort of conceived the book, we as a planet, we are using approximately still about 2 times, water use is growing 2 times faster than population growth. And we only access a very tiny fraction of the world's water, of course, but that's all we do have access to. At the rate that we're going in the ways that we are using water, for the planet 6.5 billion people, or 6.7 billion people, there probably is barely sufficient amounts, and in many parts of the world, because of the fact that water is not evenly dispersed, not enough. And we're moving to 9 billion people, and those 9 billion people want to have middle-class diets, which is even more water intensive than the progression you would get from simply the population growth. So what we are seeing already in places like the Middle East is that water scarcity, we are dividing between water have and have-nots. The Middle East ran out of water in the 1970s. The Middle East imports 50% of its food today, and with population growth is going to be importing 70% in the future. It's not an accident that the food price spikes set off and helped trigger, with the triggering event of much of the tumult that we've had in that region.
Right, and you mentioned, when you mentioned food, you consider that to be virtual water.
Well, that's well, of course, this is one of the, there's a professor in London, Tony Allen, who's done some, I think valid conceptual expression of thinking of food or other goods as virtual water. You can't move water. Water is very heavy. It's 8 1/3 pounds per gallon. It's 20% more than oil if you ever get a Jeopardy question. And you can't, and it's hard to transport. It's very energy intensive. But you can take the things that water is used to make and transport that. So food can be exported. Energy-intensive goods can be exported. So one of the hopes for the future, if we are going to be able to muddle through what's going to be, I think, a very difficult transition period in the best of circumstances, is that you're going to need a pretty robust international trading system that is reliable. And countries that have a lot of water, which I will shock you all here in Southern California, is the United States, is one of the water richest countries in the world. And we have begun to use our water more productively, but we're only scratching the surface of what we can do and must do here. Can provide not only growth to our own economies, but can also help keep the world fed and through this transition period. So I see a tumultuous period, but one that, if we're lucky, we can get through.
Tim, you mentioned in your book this notion of memes, which are kind of constellations of ideas that you feel, like genes, can be passed to subsequent generations, and that in fact that's an important element of a cultural evolution. We know that we have a number of problems, the one he just elucidated about water, rapidly running out of water, getting to the point where the next series of conflicts again is going to be returned to being over water. What do you view as the most important of these ideas, these things that can save us, since we are Homo sapiens? What are the overall concepts that really need to be more of an element of our education, more of an element of our government, that could help us face quandaries like water, quandaries like global warming?
Yeah, wow. Well, that's the great question, I guess. And I think that both Brian and Steve have sort of touched on elements of it in terms of the cooperation that they've both mentioned. But can I just say I became fascinated with memes or ideas, if you want, because they are a form of reproduction. They're just like genes reproducing. And because they are subject to, because they can reproduce and they're subject to errors in terms of that reproductive system, so there's variation, they are also subject to natural selection. So what we believe is subject to natural selection will have an impact on our society, and so the evolutionary process continues. But I think to really answer that question properly, we need to understand what's happening to humanity right now. We are going through a profound transformation at the moment. The transformation began 10,000 years ago when we first developed agriculture and then experienced the division of labour and all of the benefits that brought, and started building these civilisations unconsciously. And we came from a tribal world, a clan-based world, and I would argue it's only in the late 20th century that we moved beyond being a tribal world at the global level. The great other, the communist world, it collapsed. So essentially now the opportunity does exist to create one global intelligence. And that is going to be incredibly important for our future. And if I could talk about it by analogy just a little bit and to see what's shaping it, the other great superorganisms on the planet have a lot to teach us. So if you look at ant colonies, for example, how they work, they create civilisations that can be 8 million individuals strong, that have 40 different kinds of workers in them, the sort of complexity you might see in Elizabethan England, for example, and the same sort of scale, you know. Internally, they are totally peaceful, even though they can be genetically reasonably diverse. And the reason seems to be that large, complex superorganisms like that cannot tolerate internal strife and fighting. The cost is simply too high because of the disruption to the vital delivery of resources and the vital maintenance of that large, complex system. There's some evidence us human beings are becoming more peaceful. If you think back to Julius Caesar that we probably all studied at school, and so, you know, right through to Machiavelli, you see that even being top dog 500 years ago was a highly dangerous position. The way he got rid of people was killing them, you know. And warfare and the era of princes has continued on right through to now, but trade and the market is another way of actually gaining what you want. And it's the win-win that trade and the market gives us that's so important. So for me, the great memes, the great ideas that are important are first of all that we are utterly interdependent one upon the other in this modern world. There is no other tribe now. There's no frontier beyond which we can go. There's no enemy. There's simply us. And events that happen anywhere in the world are felt instantaneously around the world. First thing. Second thing is that this modern era of globalisation, this great forming intelligence, is empowering the individual greatly. And thankfully, due to our genetic history, our evolutionary history, we have a lot in common. This year, this month, the world passed the 7 billion mark, so 7 billion human beings on the planet. Yet there is less genetic diversity among those 7 billion beings than there is in a random sample of 50 chimpanzees from Africa. Right? We're very, very similar genetically because of bottlenecks in our past. That means that a human smile is a human smile. Anywhere on the planet, we have a basic set of aspirations and understandings that are a true basis for common humanity. So as the internet and the mobile phones and everything empower people, we are converging on a system of government democracy which actually leaves the individual empowered and able to follow their aspirations. So it's really, that I guess brings about the second idea that we are all equal, we deserve equal opportunity. That basic humanistic code is the thing that perhaps the ideal that will allow this great global intelligence to hang together in part. Thirdly, the utter dependence of that emerging global intelligence on the body that supports it on the planet. We are greedy, selfish human individuals, upright apes, if you want. But that doesn't mean we can't be an intelligence for the planet. After all, our own intelligence, our brain, weighs 2% of our body mass and yet consumes 20% of the energy that we get from our food. So it's really greedy. Right? It's also incredibly selfish. It'll cut off resources, including oxygen, to any other part of the body before it limits itself by 1 iota. Doesn't mean that greedy, selfish things can't be intelligences that integrate with the body. The one thing that they can't do is keep growing forever and destroy the resource base they depend on. So interdependency, the equality of people, one to the other, and our dependency on the planet, I think, are the three great memes that we need to embed deeply in our future.
Can I comment on, make a
comment? Go ahead, please.
I would just like to point out in the water as an example here. I mean, there is the concept of a paradigm shifts, which I think would be the way that, which don't happen very. If you know Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific theory, they don't happen, very just gradually, and they happen apparently all of a sudden, but they're actually building up behind the surface through a lot of experiments when a group of ideas which are trying to displace, if you will, the ruling governing idea at the time. Suddenly, it seems like a better alternative or a more reliable alternative. Something like that is starting to percolate in the water area. It's this. Look, we are, and I should have mentioned, we are consuming water in many places beyond the sustainable rate. We're mining groundwater to the point that they were hitting bottom of aquifers in the food belts in places like India, Pakistan, all becoming food importers. They're going to create terrible problems. We're doing it even in the United States. But there's percolating below is that the concept that we've got to start looking at water not as a separate resource by itself, but as an integrated part of an entire watershed. That you've got to start managing it with, and their models are starting to develop. There is there are NASA data that they can be used to help inform some of the understandings of what's going on inside these watersheds. So the idea is that you've got to use the existing water that you've got, because water self-renews, but it doesn't increase, right? And none of the great alternatives like desalination are ready for prime time yet. So the idea is that take with the existing water you got, start to use it, look at the ecosystem as an entity by itself, and manage it more productively and in a way that first assigns water. For the very first time, people are talking about water for environmental flows. That's a new concept. People have used water for other purposes, but never for that. So that idea, and I was at a conference not long ago where it was all about people who were thinking about this, water innovation, called Water Smart Innovation. I gave a keynote, I sat in on one of the panels, and there was an engineer talking about these concepts, advocating the concepts. Somebody in the audience raised and said, well, when you go in and get a job that you have to do for a city, do you offer these green alternatives? And he said, well, no, because if it went wrong, we could be sued and be fired. But the point is that at some point in the near distant future, these ideas will be able to say yes, and then the copying will happen. And it's starting to happen. And there are places around the planet, Singapore, Israel, Australia, that are doing things that can easily be imported even in this country and help accelerate the transition.
Could I just say, Steve, briefly to that in Australia we're having exactly that battle now about environmental flows. It involves buying water rights off farmers to give back to the environment.
Exactly.
Now, if you want to see a big political battle, that's it. But
Well,
it's
you
been
did it.
won because it's essential.
Well, you're the first place in the world that it's been won on a grand scale.
Yeah.
Now, you've written about previous civilizations, previous groups of humans that have faced some of these stresses that we're facing right now, including climate change. And I was wondering if you might elucidate a little bit, both on how the Cro-Magnons adjusted to what turns out to have been a number of pretty radical shifts in the environment, but also of this medieval warming in your previous book, The Great Warming, and what you can glean from how those people adapted.
I think a lot of it comes down to the number of people on Earth. You're dealing with many fewer people. The Cro-Magnons' reaction, for example, to a savage cold snap which lasted about 3,000 years in Europe 18,000 years ago, was simply to move from north further south into enclaves where the temperatures were more moderate. In the medieval warm, the suffering was enormous. People could not move so much because they lived on their land. They were tied to their land. The better you get tied to your land, the dynamics change. But again, populations were relatively small and they were able to roll with the punches. When you look at us, you're looking at a very frightening scenario. For the last 5 years, I've also, like Steve, been working on a history of water, and I have the first copy of it. I got this half an hour ago. But seriously, the most striking thing
And I'm
about
stealing
all of
it.
this-
And I'm stealing it.
The most striking thing about the history of water, and I'm an archaeologist, I'm working with earlier stuff than Steve is really, is the tremendous importance, which is true of the Cro-Magnons, it's true of medieval villages too, of kin ties and relationships, social relationships, long-term thinking. There's a group, and then I'm going to shut up, called the Marakwet in Kenya, northeast Kenya, who, believe it or not, and people don't know this, are still watering their fields in basically a sustainable way, using furrow channels from rivers at higher ground. They live at high elevation, which are virtually identical to those of 10,000 years ago, which is, you can say, whoopee. But what's fascinating is the way they allocate that water when it gets down to the bottom. It's done by consensus between kin groups and families and individuals. And the way we as groups and individuals behave as far as water is concerned, and all kinds of finite resources, to my mind, is the future. Because we can talk about technology that will pink in the face, but the real issue is our social mechanisms and our long-term social mechanisms, which get us to face the fact that we're going to have to change how we live. How many of you, when you brush your teeth, keep the faucet running? Put your hands up. There are about 4 honest people in the group. But seriously, it may seem trivial, but these cumulatively are the kind of things which are important.
No, we do not. No.
And the people of Bali, the rice farmers of Bali, have sustainable agriculture based on gravity irrigation, which is regulated by Buddhist temples today.
Well, let's get a little local then about water, because we have a river here in Los Angeles. I think some of you are aware of it. It's
More
largely
expensive than gas.
it's largely a canal, a ditch, and every time it rains, all the water that falls on Los Angeles just runs out to the sea. We have the Colorado River, which is greatly overtaxed. The amount of water that was allocated among the states bordering the Colorado was first estimated to be far more than that is actually present in an average year. But we're already overusing it. It winds up in a briny trickle, barely making it to the Sea of Cortez. It's not the only river to do that. I know there are other rivers all over the planet that are barely making it now to the ocean. So what could we take as lessons from the previous civilizations that you go through in your book, from the Nile, from the Mesopotamia to China to the rest? What are the salient lessons for an arid area like Los Angeles?
Well, first of all, of course, one thing you got to remember about water is that water presents itself locally. I mean, the problems of water are always presented that are very specific to the hydrology of that particular region, and it's hard to say, one thing works in one place and you can easily transport it somewhere else. We sort of did that in the 20th century with the big dams with mixed effects, I must say. But in regard to the area of Los Angeles, I mean, there are solutions that exist today that could be implemented tomorrow that would greatly alleviate the problems. And I'll give you two examples. Right now, in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, other parts of the world, people are capturing stormwater in many new ways. Stormwater is something that now runs off in Los Angeles 50% or more, 70% uncaptured, carrying the pollutants of all the road runoff because it's and through hard surface channels to the sea, creating ecological problems in the sea. So what these other cities have started to do is to use things that have been invented that are pervious concrete. There's other forms of even capture systems that capture more of the stormwater to prevent that runoff from being so intense, store it to recharge aquifers, and increase the water supply of the city. They're using other means as well to capture water, but they're also taking out concrete channels sometimes and replacing them with wetlands. That's what New Orleans. How are we going to rebuild New Orleans? One of the things that we're talking about is restore the wetlands, because wetlands are amazing. They absorb flood waters and then release it when conditions are drier. They also cleanse the water, the pollutants out of the water. So this is what I'm talking about before about this holistic, looking at the watershed in a holistic way. They're also talking about restoring using some of the ecosystem's own services that we can benefit from man, much as people did. I'm sure the Cro-Magnons did that, maybe unwittingly in their own way. But one of the lessons of history is that if you do overtax the ecosystem to the point, for example, irrigation overtaxes, always has ecosystems, and it creates salts come out of the soils, and they ruin the soil for agriculture for quite a while. Mesopotamians had to shift from wheat to barley, which was more salt resistant, and finally had to abandon the land, and power moved to other areas as they relocated. Well, we don't have, we can't do that in our planet anymore. We've got to find solutions that are going to be quote, more sustainable. But the technologies, most of the technologies are out there, are being practiced somewhere. The real problem is this organizational governance. How are we going to implement them? I mean, there are 1 billion people on the planet, just as a thought experiment, who don't have safe access to clean drinking water. I mean, I worked in Kenya. We laid pipes for waterless villages where people were walking 2 and 3 kilometers just to carry the water, which is, as I say, very heavy. This is ridiculous. I mean, the water exists. It was there. There's hardly a place in the world, outside perhaps of Yemen, where there's not enough water for people to be able to be drinking. And there's hardly a government, even the worst in the world, I mean, Mugabe or anybody, just if they want to keep stealing for a long time from the population, they wouldn't want to put in water for their populations. And yet, it's not happening. So the question is, this organizational problem is really big. I mean, it's tough. And that's the tough nut.
Well, we have barely 10 minutes left, and we did want to get some time for the audience to ask questions. I know we have a lot of smart young kids in the back there and other folks around here. You can pose your question to any or all of the panelists, and just stand up near a microphone so we can hear you. Or if you have an exceptionally loud voice, just do it from your seat. We have one question here.
Yes, I think it builds on the discussion you were just having. Professor Fagan, in The Long Summer, which I'm reading now, you made a comment about the reaction of the communities in Mesopotamia to a radical change in climate, and you noted how over a period of a couple of centuries they made a strategic and sensible decision to change how they lived in cities versus not. And I was struck when I read that with the question of whether the ability of communities to make strategic decisions like that, whether you believe we've gotten better at that in the last 15,000 years.
Oh, Brian. Well,
you have different views on it. Yeah, go on, please.
No, I think in brief, we have got better. We could always do it at the small scale, as we've heard from some of the marvellous examples from Kenya, but we're now starting to actually broker deals globally that deal with some of these things. And not with water, because that's more local, but at the Australia-wide level, I mean, 20 years ago, it was just unthinkable to put through the reforms that we've just done in Australia, because it involved a vast reallocation of money. In our country, water's money to farmers. You know, so taking away over-allocated water licences and buying up, sleeper licences and so forth just for environmental outcomes would have been unthinkable. So we are getting better, in my view.
I think the thing you've got to look at with Mesopotamia is the fact that at that point, these states were run by kings or lords who had life and death authority. That is far easier to implement something. I mean, there's the classic Chinese way of digging an irrigation canal. I ordered the deployment of 1,000 people to dig a canal. These people could do that. In a democracy like ours, it's much harder. And that's, I think, the answer. Part of it's the structure of the government, the social relationships. One of the most interesting things about early Mesopotamian agriculture, up to the time of the Assyrians and the Sasanians, which is first millennium BC, you find that most irrigation was entirely managed in the final analysis in the village. Why? Because it worked. All the rulers were interested in was the product, the tax. Local control with water is terribly important, as Steve said.
I had a question, I guess primarily for Tim, but maybe others could weigh in as well. I teach an undergraduate class in humans in the environment, and I usually can get their attention when I talk about some of these technological solutions to the problems like Stephen was talking about. It's a harder sell when I talk about biological diversity, the continued survival of threatened mammals, for example, why people who don't necessarily have an aesthetic interest in those organisms should care. And I'm kind of interested in I believe all of you are involved in education to some extent, how you kind of engage people about those, the importance of biological diversity and ecological services and so forth.
I try to do it in a fairly simple way and just point out that Earth is maintained in its current state by a very large energy budget. Plants capture about 4% of the sunlight that hits the surface of the planet. That's about 100 terawatts. It's an enormously big budget, and that is put towards making the planet habitable. The planet, from a chemical perspective and a physical perspective, would love to turn toxic. It's only that massive budget that's stopping it do it. And Steve, when he was talking about the use of reeds along this edge of waterways to purify water, that's directly harnessing energy from the sun to purify water. That's what it does. The water would love to get more salty because the chemistry of the stuff wants to make a chemical equilibrium between the crust of water and the atmosphere. But life actually holds a lot of the toxic stuff, like too much salt, in the rocks, keeps it out of the water. So biodiversity is incredibly important from that perspective. It is the muscle, the brute force that keeps the rubber band stretched, that keeps the earth habitable. So I don't know whether that'll work with teenage kids, but that's, you can think of it in just energy budget terms, I think.
We have a professor also here on the panel, so maybe...
Forgive me asking, a yes or no. Are you asking how you teach diversity? Suggestions as to how to do it? I didn't quite catch the nuance.
Not so much how to teach about diversity, but how to express its, or articulate its importance in the sustainability of human civilizations.
The answer, I suspect, as a former, thank God, professor, is anecdote from your own experience. Many, many years ago, in the days of George Washington, I was a young boy in Africa, and I was working in the middle Zambezi Valley, which was extremely remote. God, I sound like a pompous old colonial idiot. And I went into this very remote village with my girlfriend, who happened to be a local African from 3,000 foot up on the plateau. And we met the villagers. And these people were still dressed in skins and had ivory things in their noses and lot. And we looked at each other. And my girlfriend turned to me and she spoke some of the language and said, "Brian, these people are savages." She was born in this area. I told that story to classes, you could hear a pin drop. But seriously, it's your experience that makes it illuminates it, I think. And I mean, even today, I'm sometimes apprehensive talking to people who are different. But we're all human and we all smile. I think it's an anecdote.
I would just like to answer your question with a question that maybe you guys can answer.
Question.
And that is this, monoculture. I mean, one of the things that has also been happening is, for example, in irrigation, in agriculture, we have concentrated on certain strands of seed, types of seeds, for example, that we're growing very intensively. And those can become subject, particularly with climate change and other things that we're doing to the planet, to become endangered, and so the biodiversity becomes quite important if you can then introduce for adaptation purposes. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not the expert on the climate change question.
Sure, but the whole idea of a monoculture is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, all of those plants actually are made up of two separate kinds of organisms: the mitochondria and the plant itself. They can't exist without soil fungi and soil bacteria and all of those other things that are required. And when we declare war on nature by putting a plough through a field and destroying everything visible in terms of life, you're losing your water ability. It just evaporates. You can lose your soil if you get a windy day. It's a toxic form of agriculture, and we're learning that in this country and in Australia. People are using ecosystem services now to get better, more sustainable yields, larger yields from their crops, by working with biodiversity rather than against it.
We have one final question over here. I'm sorry to
If
keep you
we
waiting.
concede that there are solutions to the water problems worldwide, will they be implemented before there's worldwide conflict over the water?
Well, that of course is the unanswerable question. I think we are already seeing many parts of the world failing states. I don't think they're going to be. There may or may not be wars. I mean, Boutros Ghali famously predicted, the UN Secretary General, that the wars of the 21st century were going to be fought over water. That has not really happened, except with a few skirmishes in a few places. But we are seeing states that are failing. Yemen is a state that is terribly arid, is falling apart. There are parts that are ungovernable, where the water tables are so low people can't stay on the land. We're seeing, frankly, the big worry today. One of the worries today for the United States is Pakistan, which has not managing its water. I did an op-ed piece for the New York Times on that one, and the U.S. government is terribly worried and is focusing, trying to bring in lots of money to try to help. That was even before the floods. So I think you're going to start to see failing. You're going to see it in different forms. Failing states. You're going to start seeing famines in some areas that can't feed themselves, so therefore humanitarian food crises. We're seeing countries like Iraq do not have the electricity. There's not enough water in the Euphrates. It's being diverted by others to do basic economic development. So I think what you'll see is some of the expressions of this water crisis won't be necessarily, oh, I'm going to fight you over the source of that water, although this will happen occasionally, possibly. But more likely that there's going to be, again, failing states, humanitarian crises that would then reverberate around the world. And the answer to the question is whether we'll make it in time is, I mean, look, desalination, I'm always got to get questions about desalination and genetically modified crops. Those are the two potential silver bullets. The problem is that desal is a great technology and there's been a lot of advances in it. It's still very expensive. It has its own ecological problems, but that's not a problem because we always solve the one problem and create a new one and then you got to keep going. But to build, even if we came up with a perfect form of desal tomorrow, it would take a very long time to build it out on the scale necessary to be able to meet the crises that we are facing much more imminently. Genetically modified crops I know less about, but again, I think we're really in the very, very early days of that. So the only answer I come back to is that you got to manage the existing water in a much more productive way and in a way that is now environmentally sustainable at the same time. It's a new paradigm. It's a new concept that integrates these ecosystem services that hopefully will be then adopted by governments and others who are able and have the ability to organize, because in a lot of places in the world we don't even have the ability to organize, including sometimes in the United States. So.
Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
I have a question for you guys.